So now I'm remembering in that last section, we initialized the state into our app component. Now I want to go through a very quick flow diagram to help you understand exactly what happens step by step. In that our application was first loaded up to the browser all the way to the point in time where we saw our latitude appear on the screen. Okay? So first, we loaded up the index.html file inside of our browser, and that requested our JavaScript file with all of our React code inside of it. So the JavaScript file was loaded by the browser and then executed. When that file was executed, we created a new instance of the app component. Remember that the first function that's going to be called inside of our component automatically is the constructor function. Now, we're not required to define the constructor function. We can optionally define it if we want to do some initial setup. So if we want to define the constructor function, then we have to call the super function inside of it. If we don't call the super, we'll end up with an error. So we call the constructor function that we called super, and then right after that, we initialize our state object. So we created a new JavaScript object right here with the properties inside of it that we want to use inside of this component as state. And in our case, the only property that we're concerned about right now is latitude. Now, if for whatever reason that we also wanted to include the user's longitude, then we just have to assign it longitude to this thing as well, and then initialize it to be null. But of course, in our case, we don't care about the longitude at all. We only care about the latitude. Okay, so now after creating this object, then we assigned it to this .state property. So this state is a very specifically named property. Just like setState and render, we can't give it a different name. All right, so then the next thing that happened was that we called that geolocation service. Now, one thing that I want to be more clear about is that this callback function right here, this is not going to be invoked until we eventually return from the constructor. So we're going to run super with props. We're going to run this assignment. We're going to run get current location, and we're going to give it the callback, and then we're going to return from the constructor function. But this callback right here is not going to run until some point in time when we finally successfully fetched our position. So this setState call right here does not actually occur while we are running the constructor. Yeah? It's going to run at some point in time in the future. All right. So after that, React then takes out component, and it calls its render method, and render method then returns some amount of JSX, and that gets rendered to the page as HTML. So then we wait for some period of time, and we finally get the result of our geolocation request. And then we can execute that callback. This one right here, we take the position object, we pull our latitude out of it, and we call setState to update our states on our component. We update our state by calling setState, and when we call setState, React is going to automatically see that we updated a property on our state object. And of course, you remember that anytime that we update our state objects, React is going to almost instantly re-render the component. So React saw that we updated the state property and then called our render method a second time. And the render method returns some amount of JSX, which was then used to update the content on the screen. Now, one thing that's really important to understand here is the fact that our app component was actually rendered 2 times, right? One time when our application first started up, and then a second time after we updated our state. So there was a very small gap in time where our component was rendered onto the screen without any number right there. So in a very short time, we saw nothing on the screen. And then only after that, we got our geolocation requests completed. We finally see a number that appears right here. All right, so let's have a look. So I want to reset the permissions by clicking on the little icon right here. You can find the location and reset it to ask default, like so. Okay, so now I can just reset and refresh the browser. All right, so what's happened at this point? So we've gone through the process of calling the constructor that calls the geolocation service when we call the geolocation service. And up pops this little approval request thing right here. And then immediately after that, React has already called the component's render method, taken that JSX, and shown it on the screen with our states of latitude right here being equal to null. Now, when we render out null inside of a component, the component does not show the word null, right? It just appears blank. So at this point, we've not completed that request to get our location, right? So when I click allow right here, that's when we're finally going to call this set states, which is going to cause our component to re-render with a value of this .set state. And we see now that the number finally appears. So now I do want to focus on the second callback that we have provided to the getCurrentPosition call. Remember, this is going to take some error from that request. And right now, just console log it out. And we'll just write this here because the application's not always going to work the way that we expected. So rather than going ahead and continuing on with our application and making use of the latitude, I want to instead make sure that we'll handle this error message in a reasonable way. So it's going to be pretty easy if anything goes wrong with that getCurrentPosition request, and we'll enter this error callback right here. And we probably are going to want to re-render our component and directly tell our user, hey, something bad's happened here, and we can't really tell what location you're in, but hold on. So as we talked before, anytime that we want to render our component, we're going to update our state. So I'm going to add a new property to our state object right there. And I'm going to add a new property called error message. And I'm going to default this thing to be an empty string. So when our component is first created, we're going to have an empty error message. See where I'm going with this? But if anything goes wrong while we are attempting to get our current position, we're going to update this error message property right here. So now when we update the error message property, it's going to cause that component to re-render, and then we can attempt to show the error message inside of our render method. So come on, let's go ahead and give it a shot. So inside of the error callback right here, we're going to remove that console log and replace it with a function body like so. And then inside of here, I'll just call this .setStates and pass in an object, the property that we want to update. So in this case, I want to update the error message property on state, and I want to set it to be equal to error.message. And whenever we update our state, we are not required to update every property in it. So when we call setState with error message like so, it's not going to somehow delete our latitude. It's going to leave the latitude untouched. So when we call setState, we're only adding or changing properties on our state, right? We're never removing or deleting properties, only adding or changing. So now let's reference that error message down inside of our render method to see the warning on the browser in case we have an error. All right, so down here I'm going to put a set of parentheses, and I'll say this state.error message. All right, so now we can save this, and let's flip back over. Click on the icon right here and block location. So now we can see right here it says user denied geolocation. That's because I currently have my geolocation blocked, but I can reset it so that it'll ask me again. So default, like so. I'll refresh the page, and now I have no error message. I get my latitude to appear again. And now if we have an error message, we're going to show it. And if we don't have an error message, we are going to show our latitude. Coolio. So we're going to take a quick break right now, and I want to see you in the next lecture.